Hello and welcome everybody to our presentation called Racial Disparity in the Ontario Child Welfare System, Conceptualizing Policies and Practices that Drive Involvement for Black Families. And this presentation reflects a paper that my fabulous colleagues and I have recently published. I'd like to introduce you to these folks who have led this work, and I'm incredibly honored to be working with them. First is Faisa Mohamud, who's a recent graduate of the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work. Travonne Edwards, who's a Ph.D. student at the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work. I'm just gonna not say that over and over again. Everybody's from the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work. Our recent graduate and Dr. Kofi Antwi-Boisiako, who just recently received his Ph.D. Kenesha William, who also just graduated with her MSW, and myself, Bryn King. I'm an assistant professor at the faculty. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing today. Travonne and Faisa are going to talk about anti-Black racism as a frame for this analysis that we've done. Kofi and I will talk about disproportionate and disparate child welfare involvement. And then Faisa and Travonne are going to talk about sort of setting the stage. What is happening in terms of structural forces and institutional practices that drive involvement for Black children and families in the child welfare system. And then Travonne and I are going to talk a bit about what's happening at the front door of the child welfare system that's sort of set up to receive those referrals. As a group, we're going to put it all together, and Kenesha is going to talk about implications for practice and policy. I'll say at the outset, and then Travonne will remind you at the end, this is based on a paper that we've written, and if you don't have access to an institution that will let you access it, just email one of us and we can send it to you. So with that, I'm going to pause for 1 second.
Everyone, I'm super humble for the opportunity. I'd like to just take a moment just to resonate on the picture. This is actually a picture of this summer at the Black Lives Matter gathering in downtown Toronto. So in the midst of navigating the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a hyper-conscious awareness across the world of police violence, brutality. Evolving from a hashtag of resistance, Black Lives Matter has brought together a global community of social justice aimed at eliminating police-sanctioned violence entrenched in anti-Black racism. In contemporary times, some cases that have sparked high media tensions are Ahmaud Arbery, who was shot by white residents while going for a jog, Breonna Taylor, who was shot and killed by police in their sleep, as well as one of the most reported cases in the media, George Floyd, the disturbingly gruesome murder of George Floyd that was recorded and posted online for all those to see, which sparked global outrage. Though these issues of police violence and anti-Black racism may appear to be far and distant to some, there has actually been a documented history of this phenomenon located here in Canada. In the spring of 1992, Toronto police shot and killed Raymond Lawrence, a Black 22-year-old youth. This was the fourth murder of a Black person within police violence within a span of a few years. 2 days later, a US jury acquitted 4 Los Angeles Police Department officers who were caught on tape beating Rodney King. These series of events triggered a monumental exhibition of resistance that has been coined as the Toronto Yonge Street Riot. Following this event, the Ontario Advisor of Race Relations, Stephen Lewis, put forth a recommendation for these issues, and this was the first time locally the government has formally recognized anti-Black racism and the need for immediate change.
I'm going to talk about the theorizing of anti-Black racism, which emerged as a response to the racist policing practices in the 1990s that Travonne just touched on. The struggle against anti-Black racism can be traced back to the transatlantic slave trade, when racist stereotypes were used to dehumanize Black people and justify their enslavement. The term anti-Black racism was coined by Akua Benjamin, a Black Canadian author and activist. Benjamin defines anti-Black racism as a particular form of systemic and structural racism, which has historically and contemporarily been perpetrated against Black people. She also explains that the theory of anti-Black racism is rooted in a politics of Black radicalism and focuses on Black resistance against systems of oppression. Today, anti-Black racism continues to operate through both insidious and explicit acts of discrimination. In Ontario, the over-surveillance and criminalization of Black people is not only normalized, but it's also legalized through institutional practices. This is evidenced by street checks, also referred to as carding, which gives police the power to racially profile random people and disproportionately impacts Black people. In our paper, we argued that anti-Black racism also impacts the child welfare system. These policies and practices, which are rooted in anti-Black racism, actually create the very vulnerabilities that lead to the child welfare system's involvement with Black families. In applying an anti-Black racism lens, we discuss the ways in which structural and institutional forces shape the likelihood of Black families in Ontario being reported and investigated by child welfare agencies.
Research suggests that Black children experience disproportionality and disparity in the child welfare system. For example, Black children accounted for 6% of Ontario's child population, but they consisted of 9% of child welfare investigations in 2013. This disproportionality has increased in 2018, as Black children were 7% of Ontario's child population, but 14% of child welfare investigations. So what we find is that Black children are overrepresented among investigations because their percentage in child welfare is higher than their percentage in the general population. Compared to white children, Black children in Ontario in 2013 were 41% more likely to be investigated, 64% more likely to be substantiated, 49% more likely to be transferred to ongoing services, and 57% more likely to be placed during investigation. Again, these disparities increased in 2018. Compared to white children, Black children in Ontario in 2018 were 2.2 times more likely to be investigated, 2.5 times more likely to be substantiated, 71% more likely to be transferred, and 2.5 times more likely to be placed during investigation. A recent study by Anchibo Esiako and his colleagues used data from the first 5 cycles of the Ontario Incident Study of Reported Child Abuse and Neglect to compare incidence data on Black and white families investigated by Ontario's child welfare system over a 20-year period from 1993 to 2013. The study showed that the rate of investigations involving white families almost doubled between 1998 and 2003. But for Black families, the rate increased almost 4-fold during the same period. The study suggests that Black-white disparities in Ontario did not emerge until the implementation of structured assessment tools in 1998. In Ontario, child welfare organizations use the tools to determine a child's eligibility for child welfare service to decide whether a child is safe to remain at home or has to be placed in out-of-home care, and to also determine the risk of future harm to a child. It is argued that the tools are discriminatory because they do not account for differences and are based on dominant Eurocentric norms. The tools focus on personal failings, such as exposing children to intimate partner violence, and attend to the larger structural issues that affect Black families and place them at risk at the individual level for child welfare involvement. In Ontario, the threshold for risk of harm has been lower since 2000, when the then child welfare law was revised, and this appears to have had negative impact on Black families. Why do I say this? This is because Black families are overrepresented among the poor, and studies show that people in poverty have an increased risk for maltreatment and child welfare intervention. it is possible child welfare workers were assessing Black families at a lower threshold than white families, and this may have contributed to the differences we see in Black-white investigations rates. Workers' experience, their perspective on race, and the availability of resources may play a role in Black families being assessed at a lower threshold. Black families' social location, such as being Black and living in poverty, could also contribute to their differential treatment and place them at increased risk of being involved in the child welfare system. In Ontario, both professionals and the general public have a duty to report any incident they believe is maltreatment or represent a risk of maltreatment, even if they have made the report in the past. Such policy may also partly explain the differences in the rates of investigations between Black and white families, since research indicates that reporters may be biased in their reporting of Black families. Such bias could occur when reporters do not understand the child rearing and discipline practices of Black families and use white middle-class standards to assess them. Key findings in terms of Black-white investigations indicate that workers were less likely to identify child functioning concerns and primary caregiver risk factors in Black families than in white families. But workers were more likely to identify socioeconomic challenges for Black families than for white families. When comparing similarly situated Black and white families across these characteristics, differences in rates of transfer to ongoing services were significant. Vulnerable Black families were more likely to be transferred.
So as Kofi indicates, a lot of what we're seeing about what happens in terms of disparities start at the front door. They can continue with sort of later child welfare involvement as families move through the system. But one of the things that the research has consistently demonstrated is that the disparities really begin at the front door. And some of the work that we've done is to look at the origin of disparities at the referral stage. And our work in 2013 indicates that these referral disparities are related to the two most common reasons Black families are reported and the two most common referral sources. So the two most common reasons Black families are reported are physical abuse and exposure to intimate partner violence. And the two referral sources that make the majority of referrals for Black families are schools and law enforcement. So in 2013, the majority of physical abuse referrals, just in general, were initiated by schools, but the proportion was higher for Black families than for white families. And again, in 2013, the majority of exposure to IPV referrals were initiated by law enforcement, but this proportion again was higher for Black families than it was for white families. And I will say, although we're not presenting data from 2018, that these patterns hold in 2018. And this sort of begs the question, and this is kind of the focus of this paper, which is what is driving this contact with CAS in Ontario? And I'm going to turn it over to Faisa to start talking about why.
So we looked at the institutionalization of anti-Black racism through broader structural forces. In our paper, we discussed the ways in which the federal immigration system's practices were shaped by ideologies such as whiteness, patriarchy, and capitalism. Historically, the Canadian government stereotyped Black Caribbean applicants as mentally, physically, and culturally inferior, therefore requiring them to prove their suitability. These anti-Black sentiments are at the core of an immigration system that still upholds applicants who are deemed desirable through the use of a point system. For Black Caribbean mothers, this legacy of racism, sexism, and classism is a lingering reality as they continue to be separated from their children when they come to Canada to work as live-in caregivers. Both live-in caregivers and refugees, particularly those from Africa, experience longer waiting periods for family reunification. This biased migration process takes an emotional toll on Black immigrant and refugee families, contributes to difficulties in the parent-child relationship, and is often compounded by systemic barriers such as xenophobia and anti-Black racism. Our paper also looked at the ways in which employment barriers contribute to income inequality for Black people in Ontario and more broadly Canada. Since the early 1900s, Black people have had limited job opportunities working in segregated occupations, earning lower wages due to anti-Black racism. In 2020, this continued to be a barrier for Black Canadian adults who earn lower salaries and have higher rates of unemployment. The employment and housing systems have traditionally worked together to prevent Black people from integrating and advancing in Canadian society. Ontario's anti-Black housing policies date back to the 1800s when Black people were systematically denied land and home ownership. This is a trend that continued into the 1920s with Caribbean immigrants who were discriminated against by landlords. More recently, we can see the residential segregation of African immigrants who tend to live in predominantly Black neighborhoods that are spatially segregated and lower income. We know that individuals and families with lower incomes face greater difficulties in meeting their basic needs, which makes them more likely to live in segregated housing. For Black families living at the intersections of Blackness, poverty, and immigrant status, there's greater risk for child welfare involvement.
Thank you, Faisa. And really zoning in on some of these institutional forces, we can see that mental health is a potential driver of racial disparities for Black families. Children's Mental Health of Ontario estimates that there are 200,000 children in Ontario who have never had any contact with mental health services, despite experiencing significant mental health concerns. Unfortunately, there's an increase in waitlists for mental health services for young people, as sometimes they find themselves waiting for almost 3 years for services. The lengthy wait times contribute to these breakdowns within families, as these challenges are associated with young people missing school, parents missing work, and compound over time. Research also indicates that mental health needs are a significant contributor to child welfare involvement and decision-making for youth over time. Although the research is limited, there is evidence that identifies these issues are heightened amongst racialized communities. Alongside the educational system, there are various institutional settings which interlock and heighten the risk for child welfare involvement for Black families. The Ontario Human Rights Commission released a report examining racial profiling across 3 different systems, such as the education, child welfare, and police, which was described as a specific racial discrimination that pertains to the safety and security. Notably, the report states that majority of profiling reports came from school settings, emphasizing that Indigenous and racialized students are stereotyped as aggressive, more likely perceived as having behavioral difficulties, and often assumed to have initiated conflict. Examples of anti-Black racism in this setting include being streamed into non-academic courses, receiving more punitive punishments, and public consequences in contrast to their white peers. Research also demonstrates that the child welfare system often serves as a pipeline that leads children and youth towards involvement in the justice system, which can likely exacerbate their already complex needs. It is important to note that young people who have spent time in group care are overrepresented in the justice system. In 2016, the former Ministry of Children and Youth Services conducted a systems-wide analysis across the residential sector that highlighted the criminalization of Black youth. The report confirmed that Black youth were significantly underrepresented in mental health services and overrepresented in focused containment, specifically the Roy McMurtry. Understandably, criminalization of Black people living with mental health concerns serves as a barrier for families seeking mental health support. The recent killing of DeAndre Campbell, a 26-year-old youth diagnosed with schizophrenia who called the police for a wellness check, serves as a concrete example. In August 2020, the Ontario Human Rights Commission conducted a second report which investigated racial profiling and discrimination once again. They found that Black people are more likely to be arrested, charged, overcharged, struck, shot, and or killed by police officers. Although charges rates were disproportionately greater for Black people, the report actually revealed that they were overrepresented in cases withdrawn and less likely to receive conviction in contrast to their white counterparts. So when we look at the child welfare system, we know that the majority of investigations occur in Ontario. which is the most populated province. The shift has likely been linked into changes in the child protection standard and investigation criteria. More specifically, Ontario Child Welfare Eligibility Spectrum expanded the criteria for determining whether or not a concern about a child was eligible for an investigation by including family level circumstance that might put a child at risk of harm. Hey, Bryn, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you. So building off of what Travonne was just talking about, the increased eligibility is kind of related to an interpretation of sort of the legislation that mandates that there be child protective service involvement for families where there has been an event that causes harm, as well as an event that presents risk of harm. And the eligibility spectrum has been interpreted from that risk of harm standard. And over time, what has been interpreted from that standard and sort of codified in the eligibility spectrum now becomes sort of part of the mandate to report. And so that includes things like, along with sort of these traditional things that we think about for child protection, service involvement, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect. It has now expanded to include things like, as my colleagues have mentioned, exposure to intimate partner violence, caregiver functioning concerns such as mental health or substance abuse, and things like parent-child conflict, which is very related to some of the things that Travonne was just talking about in terms of the depletion of the mental health services for families that are struggling. So ultimately, what gets reported now is anything that looks like it causes risk of harm to children, or anything that might present that's associated with a risk for future maltreatment. And that has then translated into a very high standard for reporting. So the liability in terms of the duty to report, which Kofi talked about, is very high. So the stress around needing to report combined with this very low threshold for reporting means that in this middle piece, we've been pulling in many families that look like they're at risk for child welfare involvement. And I'll just add, because this is work that I've been sort of thinking about for a while, is that this increased role of child welfare in the lives of families is coinciding with a stripping away of the public safety net supports that would step in where families are struggling. So now in terms of who's at the bottom of that safety net, it's really child welfare. They're the only game in town. And the way that the policy is structured is now that they have to hold families accountable for larger systemic issues that place children at risk. And the only way that the child welfare system can work is if it identifies the caregivers as being responsible for creating those circumstances. And really it's sort of moved into the ether, as we know from most kinds of structural analysis and critical theory, that when it sort of moves into sort of the public consciousness around this is what we need to report, this is the mandate to report, those shifts have resulted in greater reports over time. I'll also just mention, and then I'm going to move on, that the sort of the standards that are embedded within the legislation and within the child protection standards and this kind of risk of harm standard, it's assumed to be race neutral. But given this work that we've talked about, we would really argue that these policies and these practices are highly racialized in that they target the very circumstances and conditions that anti-Black racism creates. I'm gonna, I think that's, yeah, that I was gonna mention something else, but I think I already covered it. So I'm gonna bring everybody else up and we're gonna talk about this this full conceptual model that we have been working on.
Thank you so much, Bryn. So as Bryn mentioned, this is a conceptual model that essentially brings together the full paper, right? Brings together what Faisa talked about, what Kofi talked about, what I talked about, and really allows you to visualize the way Black families are centered in this nexus of structural violence, institutional policies and practices, and child welfare policy. So at the top of the model, we have this continuum of anti-Black racism that penetrates through structures, institutions, and policy that essentially places the Black family at heightened risk of investigation. And within that, we see that there's various other elements that my colleagues will further elaborate on.
So at the structural level, we can see how anti-Black racism is institutionalized through immigration policies that continue to separate Caribbean and African parents living in Canada from their children, housing policies that result in the residential segregation of families, as well as employment barriers that contribute to income inequality.
And if you look at the structural forces, it shapes almost as a sea that directly hovers over the institutions such as mental health, education, and the legal system that then work with one another. They interlock and essentially place the family at heightened surveillance, which then leads into the next piece, which is child welfare policy.
And so as we've been articulating all of these kind of structural forces and institutional practices sort of put Black families, by and large, not all Black families, this is not going to explain all of the disparity that we see in child welfare referrals, but it does explain a lot of it, that it sort of puts families in a situation that is sort of perfectly aligned with the standards that have been set in terms of risk of harm and eligibility for investigations. It's almost like it's a puzzle piece that is perfectly designed to fit in with its neighbors and results in higher rates of referrals for Black families pretty consistently, and some might argue in ways that are actually increasing. I'm gonna give the floor to Kenesha, who's going to talk about the implications for this. It's just going to take me 1 second to do that. Everybody just. Sorry, this is taking longer than I thought. Go ahead,
Bryn. So when highlighting the implications of child welfare policy and practice in general, the structural policies mentioned earlier by my colleagues are infused within the practices of local institutions such as child welfare agencies, social service agencies, schools, etc., which perpetuate anti-Black racism against children and families through harmful acts of over-surveillance, stigmatization, and neglect. So for example, the Ontario Child Protection Standards have a strict duty to report when children are harmed, with a low threshold for reporting as driven by the eligibility spectrum, but high accountability for not reporting it. It is important that the child welfare processes shift away from investigations that perpetuate over-surveillance, criminalization, and move more towards focusing on supporting families who are experiencing structural inequalities such as racism, poverty, and income inequality. In knowing that schools are one of the top sources to report Black children and families into the child welfare system, they should be aiming to reduce rates of unnecessary and inappropriate reporting by managing the flow of referrals at the entry point of child welfare system to induce changes of overrepresentation and over-surveillance. Additionally, when practicing, professionals should acknowledge and place more emphasis on the strengths of Black families and how they can use that to address challenges they may face, instead of them being critiqued by traditional Western ideals on child safety and constructed notions of risk ideals on safety and parenting practices. Given the ways in which the structural and institutional forces actually target and increase risk for Black families in Ontario, we suggest that the role of the current child welfare system in Black families' lives needs to be fundamentally redefined. This effort would require a radical overhaul of the CYFSA, and in particular, the Ontario Child Protection Standards and the duty to report. so that the threshold and criteria for reporting and screening no longer target vulnerability generated and maintained by anti-Black racism. In order for these changes to take place, Black people, including children, families, and community members who are impacted, should be able to define culturally relevant meanings of risk. Culturally relevant supports should be put into place, and the voices of Black children and families need to be amplified and acknowledged. Additionally, more Canadian race-based research should be conducted and implemented in the future to help with these changes.
Wonderfully said, Tanisha. So thank you so much to the entire Rights for Children Youth Partnership team for having us. This is the first time we've disseminated this paper, which honestly, I have to give a special shout out to our supervisor, mentor, colleague, and friend, Dr. Bryn King, for supporting us through the hard times, the great times, and all the way down to the end. If anyone has a question, thought, feeling, wants to contact, network, please see all of our emails here. Feel free to reach out to any one of us and we'll be sure to respond to you. Also, please feel free to follow us on Instagram. We have the Youth at the Youth Wellness Lab, as well as any Facebook or any other social media. That's essentially it. I am so humbled and we're super excited to continue this work. And we hope that all of you will stay tuned for more work around this topic.
Just so you know, here are some of the papers that have come out of this team that reflect the data and the ideas that we were presenting today. And if you would like a copy of any of these papers, please feel free to reach out in all of the ways that Travonne just talked about. And thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you again.